Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my presentation about the Incunabula era and the causes and effects of the rise of printing and the impact that more readily available books had on Western civilization. This is my presentation on part 2, so I would like to look at the effect of printing on European society. And in many cases, large changes take hundreds of years to see progress, and great shifts often aren't seen until you're looking back at them, so in hindsight and retrospect. However, printing caused significant changes early on in its use. It became very apparent that printing was a prime mover. It was very important, and many things happened afterwards thanks to printing, and without printing and more readily available books, perhaps some of the very significant historical events that have happened would not have played out the way they did. Once again, I have 5 different topics that I'd like to bring up and talk about in this presentation, specifically things and people who I believe, events that I believe were good examples of the effect of printing. So the first person I'd like to talk to, seen pictured there, William Caxton, is considered the first English printer. He apparently brought the printing press to England and began to print there. He's a very interesting printer because he, of course, printed in Latin, which was a very common language then. However, not very many people knew how to read it, and at this point, not very many people were speaking it on a daily basis. Rather, they were using vernacular languages such as the English vernacular, or the French or Italian or German vernacular. Caxton printed in Latin, but he also printed primarily in English and French, and most frequently in English. Furthermore, Caxton printed popular titles. He did not necessarily only print religious texts or scholarly texts. He printed novels and fiction and poetry and history and popular science titles in English. This is very significant because it was changing, it marked a shift in what people were interested in reading. Or perhaps not that what people were interested in reading it was changing, but perhaps now that it was available, now that printing made books more readily available, people could start to read what they wanted. And William Caxton certainly benefited from that. His business was very strong, and though his books were not beautiful, not like perhaps Gutenberg's or even Manutius's, who I will talk about in the next slide, his works were easy to read, his works were popular to read, and that made him a good businessman. He stood out for that reason. He stood out because he printed popular titles. He printed things written by women, which was rather unheard of at that time. And, today we go to the grocery store and we see cheap paperbacks, and perhaps this is a glimpse of what Caxton's work may have been at that time. While it wasn't beautiful, it got the content across, and I think that is something, that is a major shift that printing allowed to have happen, that a book didn't necessarily have to look pretty or be very expensive as long as it got the point of the writing, of the actual content of the novel or the poetry, whatever was being presented. As long as that was clear, as long as people could read and understand that, then it was okay and it would be bought. And William Caxton's business proves that. The next printer that I'd like to talk about is Aldus Manutius. He was an Italian printer, And he was the first one to use italics, so that kind of slanted writing, even that you see in the title that says his name, was a form of Roman type that he developed, and it was meant to look similar to handwriting, but not necessarily be as difficult to read as handwriting could be. And that's important because before printing, before standardized type, handwriting and manuscripts were very difficult to read. It was very close together. Sometimes there were no spaces at all, or no perceivable spaces between words or sentences, or even paragraphs. It was very, very jumbled and very condensed, and it made it hard to read. And so these printers who strived not only to use a language like Caxton that multiple people, many people, the majority of people could read and understand, but to also use a font that people could easily read and understand. Those were very important aspects of this. Similar to Caxton, Manutius pushed the boundaries of what could be printed. He did print your typical grammars and Bibles and other religious texts, but he also printed things that may have been considered risque, such as A Dream of Love, and that is a piece of prose that by no means today's standards would qualify as erotica. It certainly had erotic themes and could be perceived as such. And the idea of printing things that were not religious and even perhaps a little bit sinful to that day and age's morality shows that printing pushed boundaries. Printing made people want to get out of those very tightly confined borders of what reading could be. The idea of reading for fun, reading the Canterbury Tales, Caxton's Canterbury Tales, or reading A Dream of Love. Those were meant to be enjoyed, not just meant to instruct. And that's a big shift. That is a very important thing to realize, that printing did for reading, and having all sorts of books available and having all sorts of content available really stretched, and even today is continuing to stretch what is acceptable to society and to push those boundaries. Manutius also was a very interesting printer in the fact that he attempted to incorporate one-point linear perspective into his printing. So one-point linear perspective is trying to make a 3D perspective apparent on a 2D surface. You may see a lot of that in Renaissance paintings where it looks like you're staring down a courtyard, and when the forefront of the picture, you're perhaps under an arch, but in the background of the picture you see further into the courtyard. He did that with his printing, and in the web page next to the little blurb that I wrote about him, I do have a picture of Dream of Love and this one-point linear perspective, but done with not only the pictures included in the book, but also with the way that the words frame the book, and this kind of immersive technique trying to pull readers into what they're reading. I find that very interesting, and today you may even see it in books that push that form. It's pushing the form of books, because perhaps content hasn't changed much. Perhaps we really do, humans really do only write about what they can perceive and feel, and there's only so much that a human can think and feel, whether it's in the 15th century or today. But you can certainly push the form and the way that it's presented, the way that content is presented. And Manutius, through his one-point linear perspective, certainly did that, or attempted that. and I do believe rather successfully. The next event and person that I would like to talk about is the Reformation, and that is a portrait of Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation. This happened just outside of the frame of the Incunabula. So the Incunabula really were things probably printed between mid 15th century and 1501, so the very, very beginning of the 16th century. And the Reformation occurred in 1517. So it's just outside of that. However, the events that occurred surrounding the Reformation certainly tie in with printing. Martin Luther had been a monk who felt very unsatisfied in his life, and he sought to understand the scriptures better, and so he read, and he was fortunately one of the people who could read. And as he read the Bible, he felt that the Roman Catholic Church was misinterpreting what it was saying, and he felt that a reform was needed because it was withholding people from developing their own religious convictions and rather dictating and not allowing people to think for themselves religiously. So he wrote 95 theses and nailed them to his local church's door, indicting the Roman Catholic Church of not accurately sharing what the Bible said and not allowing followers to express themselves religiously and really delve into the religion on their own. People, I believe, were tired of feeling repressed by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was in power. It was a very powerful force, and in many areas it was corrupt. And I think people were tired of that, so they latched on to Luther's Reformation, and so he printed pamphlets to spread these ideas. And the key to that is that he printed pamphlets.